My name is Gerald Whitfield. I am 70 years old, and I built my life from the ground up right here in Houston. Until last Tuesday, I thought the worst pain a man could endure was burying his wife. I was wrong. I went to the garage to check on my late wife's pride and joy, a pristine 1966 Ford Mustang, Shelby GT500. That car was her life's work. What I found instead was bare concrete and a fresh oil stain where it used to sit. When I reached my 38-year-old son, Clifton, he was somewhere near an airport gate background noise and all, and he told me without missing a beat that he'd gone ahead and sold it. "Mom is gone, Dad," he said. "Why are you holding on to a piece of scrap metal?" Renata had been struggling badly with depression. She needed Paris. He told me something to pull her out of it. "Get over it, old man." The words hit me like a fist. Then about an hour on my phone buzzed. Sterling Beaumont, a classic car dealer here in Houston. "Gerald," he said, voice tight with urgency. "Your son offloaded the Shelby for a fast cash transfer. Get down here." Evelyn stashed something inside the door panel before she passed. "Welcome back to Dadrevenge. I am glad you're here. If stories like this one stay with you, consider following along, so you never miss another one. It means more than you know. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something based on what you have heard so far. Where do you think a father's silence and patience might lead when everything he built is under threat? Drop your guess below. One more thing. Some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. It is the truth inside the story that matters. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months since I buried my wife, Evelyn. 42 years of marriage gone in the blink of an eye to a sudden heart attack. The house felt immense and silent without her. She was the fire in my life, the spark that helped me build Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics from a single battered delivery truck into a 400 fleet empire stretching across the South. But her real passion, her absolute obsession, lived out in the garage of our Sugarland home, a 1966 Ford Mustang Shelby, GT500 Night Miss Blue with white racing stripes. For 25 years, that car was her sanctuary. She tracked down original parts from every corner of the world, putting in the painstaking work of restoring every inch with her own hands. That car wasn't just metal and rubber, it was a piece of her soul. After she passed, I made a habit of walking out to the garage each morning just to breathe in the smell of oil and leather, just to feel something close to her. That Tuesday, I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the garage with a thermos of black coffee in my hand. I stopped dead in my tracks. The thermos slipped from my fingers, clanging hard against the concrete. Hot liquid splashed up against my boots, but I barely registered it. The garage was empty. The space where the Shelby had sat the night before was violently vacant. The only sign it had ever been there was a dark, fresh oil drip near the center of the bay. A cold panic seized my chest. I checked the side door, locked. The main garage door mechanism was intact. No broken windows, no sign of forced entry, no alarm triggers. The security system hadn't recorded so much as a flicker of a breach. Someone had used the master key. Someone who knew the codes. Someone who understood exactly how to move around the sensors without tripping them. My mind raced through the short list. Only 2 people besides me held both the access codes and the physical keys to that garage: my estate manager, who is currently on vacation in Arizona, and my son Clifton. Clifton is 38 years old. He lives in a sleek, glass-heavy monstrosity of a house just 4 blocks away, a house I helped him put the down payment on. He has always had expensive tastes that accelerated sharply when he married Renata 4 years ago. Renata, who never encountered a luxury brand she didn't feel she was owed. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed Clifton's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hey, Dad." "What's up?" His voice was far too relaxed, but what hit me immediately was the background echoing PA announcements, the dull roar of terminal crowds, the sharp chime of an intercom. He was at George Bush Intercontinental Airport. "Clift," I said, my voice pulled tight. "Where are you and where's your mother's car?" A brief pause followed. Not the pause of a guilty man, the pause of someone mildly inconvenienced. "I'm at the airport, Dad," he said, sighing heavily. "Renata and I are heading to Europe for a few weeks." "I don't care about your vacation," I snapped, the anger finally punching through the shock. "I want to know where the Shelby is." "Look, Dad, I didn't want to turn this into a whole thing. He slipped into that condescending tone he always reached for when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. I sold it. The words landed like a punch. I had to brace myself against the workbench. You what? I sold it? He repeated it louder, talking over a boarding announcement. Mom is gone, Dad. She's been gone for 6 months. Why are you keeping a piece of scrap metal sitting in the garage? It's collecting dust and dragging you down every time you look at it. That car I hissed was your mother's life's work. It wasn't yours to sell. You stole it, Clifton. Stole it, he scoffed. Dad, don't be dramatic. I'm your only heir. It would have come to me eventually anyway. I just moved up the timeline. Besides, I needed the liquidity. Liquidity for what? I demanded. Renata has been severely depressed lately, he said, as though that settled the matter. You know how devastated she was by Mom's passing. I nearly laughed out loud at that. Renata hadn't shed a single genuine tear at Evelyn's funeral. She had spent the wake complaining about the caterer. She desperately needed a trip to Paris to clear her head. Clifton went on smooth as ever. First-class five-star hotels the whole way. She needs to reset. I did it for my wife's mental health, Dad. You, of all people, should get that. You always put Mom first. I'm just doing the same. Get over it. It's just a car. The audacity was breathtaking. He had violated my home, stolen his mother's legacy, and was now holding me up as the example for why he was justified in doing it. Listen, they're calling our boarding group, Clifton said, picking up speed. We'll be out of range for a while. We can sort this out when we're back. Just relax, Dad. Take up golf or something. The line went dead. I stood in the empty garage, the silence pressing in around me. He genuinely believed his own story. He expected me to absorb the theft of a priceless classic car, sold to bankroll a luxury European getaway for his spoiled wife, and chalk it up to grief. He thought I was just a senile old widower who would eventually soften and forgive him because he shared my blood. But as the initial shock drained away, something colder and sharper moved in to replace it. The hard logic of a man who didn't build a major logistics company by letting people take from him unchallenged. I walked back into the house and settled at my desk. Something in Clifton's story didn't add up. A first-class trip to Paris, even at the finest hotels money could buy, might run $30,000, maybe $40,000, if Renata went completely wild on the Ritz. But I knew exactly what that Shelby was worth. Evelyn and I had it appraised for insurance purposes just a year ago. A fully restored numbers-matching 1966 Shelby GT500 in that condition carried a minimum value of $350,000 on today's market. Probably more to the right buyer. So where was the other $310,000? Clifton was arrogant, yes, entitled certainly, but he wasn't foolish enough to trade a $350,000 asset for a fraction of its value just to buy plane tickets. He was covering something. The Paris story was a smokescreen, a plausible lie engineered to make me furious about his sense of entitlement rather than suspicious of what he was actually doing. My gut said there was a much larger play in motion. I had to move. I reached for my phone to call my attorney, Celeste Osgood, to immediately freeze his access to the family trust and begin cutting him out of my will entirely. If he wanted to treat his mother's legacy like a personal ATM, he would never see another dollar of mine. My finger was hovering over Celeste's name when the phone buzzed in my hand. An incoming call. The caller ID read Sterling Beaumont. Sterling was the owner of the largest and most respected classic car dealership in the Houston area. He was an old associate of Evelyn's. They had spent years swapping parts, debating restoration techniques, talking shop at all hours. Sterling was a blunt man, old school to the bone, not one to tolerate nonsense, but he had respected Evelyn more than anyone else in the business. I answered immediately. Gerald. His voice was low, wound-tight, with an urgency I had never heard from him before. I'm sorry to be calling this early, but we've got a serious situation here. I know, I said flatly. My son stole the Shelby. I'm guessing he brought it to you. Yeah, he did, Sterling replied, his tone grim. Drove it onto my lot about 2 hours ago. Pushed for a fast cash wire transfer. Told me you were downsizing and he was handling the estate. The kid was sweating. Gerald rushing me like he had somewhere he desperately needed to be. Did you pay him? I asked, tightening my grip on the phone. I started the wire to get him off my lot, Sterling said carefully, but I placed a 24-hour internal hold on the funds. I know what that car meant to Evelyn. There was no way she ever would have let that arrogant kid sell it, certainly not to bankroll some European joyride. A wave of gratitude hit me for the man's instincts. Thank you, Sterling. I'll have my attorney file a stolen asset dispute right away. Gerald, hold on. Sterling cut in, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. That's not why I'm calling. Forget the wire transfer for a minute. What is it? When he dropped the car off, I had my guys run a standard intake inspection, Sterling explained. Evelyn was always meticulous, but I noticed the passenger side interior door panel was sitting slightly off, just a fraction of an inch out of true. I frowned. Evelyn was a perfectionist. She would never have left a panel misaligned. I pulled it off to reseat the clips. Sterling continued, his voice heavy. Gerald, your son didn't just dump a car on my lot. Evelyn left something concealed inside the door cavity. The air in my study seemed to go very still. What did she leave? I can't say exactly what it all is, Sterling said carefully, but it's got your name on it. You need to get yourself down to my warehouse right now, Gerald. You need to see this for yourself. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the darkened screen. The call had ended, but Clifton's voice was still ringing in the quiet of my study. Get over it. He had said those words to me. My own flesh and blood had violated the sanctity of my home, stolen the legacy his mother had poured her life into preserving, and waved it away as though he'd borrowed a garden tool. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. He thought he had me all figured out. He looked at me and saw a tired, grieving 70-year-old widower who would swallow his disrespect to keep the peace. He had mistaken my silence over the past 6 months for weakness, a symptom of a broken man simply waiting out his days. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I did not build Whitfield cold chain logistics by turning the other cheek. When I started out with a single battered delivery truck, competitors tried to run me off the road. I crushed them. I built a fleet of 400 refrigerated trucks, moving millions across the South, by seeing through deception and hitting back twice as hard. My grief had made me quiet. It had not made me blind. I stood in the center of my home office and started doing what I do best. I stood there and worked the numbers. Clifton was arrogant, entitled, and far too dependent on the trust fund I had set up for him, but he wasn't careless. He claimed he sold Evelyn's Shelby to finance a vacation for Renata. It was a credible lie engineered to make me furious about his sense of entitlement, so I wouldn't look any harder at what was actually going on with his finances. He wanted me seething over a luxury trip to Paris, not digging into his current situation. My gut twisted with that sharp, familiar instinct, the same one that had shielded my company from hostile takeovers and crooked vendors decades ago. Clifton was making a desperate move. He needed cash immediately. He was either burying a financial crisis or funding something far worse. I walked to my desk and picked up my phone. I scrolled to Celeste Osgood, my hard-edged corporate attorney. My intention was to have her freeze his access to the family trust strip, whatever remaining shares he held in my company, and draw up the paperwork to cut him out of my will completely. If my son wanted to treat his mother's legacy like a personal cash reserve, I would make certain he never laid hands on another son of mine for the rest of his life. I pressed my thumb toward her name. Before the screen could register the touch, the phone shuddered in my palm. An incoming call pushed Celeste's contact aside. The caller ID showed Sterling Beaumont. I said nothing further to Sterling on the phone. I ended the call, dropped the phone into my jacket pocket, and walked out of my study. I moved through the house without stopping and went straight out the front doors to my daily driver, sitting in the circular driveway. I did not call local authorities to report a theft. I did not call Clifton back to rage at him or demand answers. When you have spent 4 decades building a massive logistics operation from nothing at all, you learn fast that you do not telegraph your counterattack with noise and spectacle. You move in total, deliberate silence. The drive to the Sterling Beaumont Classic Car Warehouse took exactly 35 minutes, but my mind ranged across entire decades during those miles. I thought about my son, a man who had grown so thoroughly at ease on the cushions of the wealth I provided, that he had come to mistake my generosity as a father for a kind of profound stupidity. Then I thought about Evelyn. Evelyn was not simply a wife who happened to love restoring vintage American muscle cars on the weekends. She was the sharpest, most relentlessly analytical woman I had ever known. While I was out negotiating cold chain supply contracts and managing heavy truck fleets across the South. She was the one planted in the corporate offices, working through the ledgers line by line. She served as chief financial officer of Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics for 30 solid years. Her mind worked like a steel trap, and her instinct for human deception bordered on the supernatural. She could sniff out an embezzler or a corporate fraud from a dozen miles away. If a woman with that kind of calculating precision had taken the trouble to conceal something deep within the structural frame of her most prized possession, it was not a sentimental keepsake or a fond farewell. It was a weapon. It was an insurance policy. I pulled up to the heavy security gates of the Sterling Beaumont Classic Car Warehouse. The building was an imposing, unmarked concrete structure on the industrial edge of the city, ringed by heavy chain-link fencing and high-definition security cameras. The massive steel gate rolled open the moment my front bumper reached the sensor. Sterling was already waiting just inside the wide main receiving bay. He stood in silence next to the pristine 1966 Shelby GT500. Under the hard, flat glare of the warehouse fluorescents, the deep night mist blue paint seemed to pull all the light from the room into itself. Sterling offered no polite greeting. He didn't put out his hand. His expression was grim and entirely businesslike. He simply tilted his head and gestured toward the passenger side of the car. I walked to it, my boots ringing sharply against the polished concrete. The interior leather panel of the passenger door had been carefully detached and laid out on a soft microfiber cloth, draped over a nearby rolling workbench. The door's inner workings were fully exposed. Window regulators, metal framing, sound-dampening material, all of it laid bare. Right there, buried deep in the dark steel cavity of that door, nestled behind a thick layer of acoustic soundproofing foam, was a rectangular void where something had been fixed in place. Sterling reached into the breast pocket of his work jacket and produced a heavy-duty, fireproof document pouch. The edges were sealed with industrial waterproof tape. He extended it toward me, and I took it from his hands. The material was thick, textured, and surprisingly dense. Through the translucent exterior, I could make out the contents clearly. There was a standard black USB flash drive and a neatly folded piece of heavy cream stock writing paper. It was Evelyn's preferred stationery. My hands, which had stayed perfectly steady through bruising labor union negotiations and the teeth of vicious corporate raiders, began to shake. I lifted a small utility knife from Sterling's workbench, sliced carefully through the reinforced waterproof seal, and drew out the folded paper. I knew her handwriting the instant I saw it. That elegant, sharp cursive was unmistakable. The date at the top right corner of the page stopped the air in my lungs. It was written exactly 14 days before the massive coronary episode that took her from me. She had sat down and put this letter on paper a mere 2 weeks before she died. I unfolded it slowly. The black ink was dark, deliberate, pressed firmly into every line. "Gerald," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means our son took the bait." A freezing chill moved up from the base of my spine and spread all the way out to my fingertips. I forced my eyes to keep moving across the steady, meticulous cursive. You always wanted to believe the best about Clifton. You always wanted to believe that his towering arrogance was just a passing phase, that Reneda's endless greed was youthful ignorance she would eventually outgrow. But I have spent my entire professional life tracking liabilities, and our son is the greatest liability this family has ever produced. I intentionally left a pre-signed blank title to this car, hidden in the bottom of the glove box. I knew that the moment I was out of the picture, Clifton would start hunting for liquid assets to feed Renata's insatiable appetite for luxury. I wanted to test his fundamental greed. I wanted to see whether he would honor my legacy and protect the things I loved, or whether he would trade them away for quick, untraceable cash. If this letter is in your hands right now, you have your definitive answer. I stopped reading for a moment, my chest heaving. My wife had constructed a posthumous loyalty test from beyond the grave, and the son I had raised, the boy I had funded and shielded, had failed it in the most spectacular and offensive way imaginable. He did not hesitate. He did not mourn. He simply saw his mother's death as a chance to cash in a blank check. The letter did not end there. I swallowed the hard knot in my throat and moved my eyes to the final paragraph on the page. But this is not just about a stolen car. Gerald Clifton is not simply behaving like a spoiled, entitled child throwing a tantrum. He is actively bankrolling a betrayal that will systematically dismantle everything we spent our lives constructing together. The black USB drive inside this pouch contains everything I have been quietly investigating for the last 6 consecutive months. I did not want to bring this to you until I had irrefutable proof, but my health has been declining and I fear I may run out of time. Plug it into a secure machine. Study the data I have compiled. Follow the banking trails. Do not let your love for him as a father blind you to the cold, hard math. Burn the rot out of our house, Gerald. Do what absolutely must be done. I folded the heavy writing paper back along its original creases and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I reached into the fireproof document pouch and drew out the small black flash drive. It sat weightless in my palm, yet it felt denser than a block of solid lead. Evelyn had devoted her final months on this earth to protecting me running down a threat I had been completely blind to. She had turned that brilliant analytical mind of hers toward a conspiracy, unfolding right beneath my roof, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. I looked up at Sterling. His face stayed completely stoic, but I could see the quiet understanding behind his eyes. He had known Evelyn well enough to know that whatever was on that drive was going to bring the ceiling down. Sterling, I said, my voice eerily steady, scrubbed clean of the shock and grief that had swallowed me just an hour before. I need to use the secure computer in your back office right now. Sterling gave a single nod, turned on his heel, and motioned for me to follow him down the long, dimly lit corridor of the warehouse. I gripped the flash drive so hard the plastic casing bit into my palm. Clifton thought he was running a clever game. He believed he had outmaneuvered a clueless old man, but he had fundamentally forgotten who his mother was, and he was about to find out exactly who his father was. I followed Sterling through the heavy steel doors into his private back office. The room was sparsely decorated, smelling faintly of rich motor oil and stale black coffee. Sterling bypassed his main desktop and pulled a ruggedized industrial laptop from a locked steel cabinet. He set it flat on the desk and lifted the lid. The screen came to life, throwing a cold blue glow across the darkened room. Sterling gestured toward the leather chair, silently giving me the seat. I sat down my joints, registering a sudden bone-deep exhaustion. I drew a long, steadying breath and pressed the small black flash drive into the side port of the machine. A security prompt flashed immediately on the screen. Evelyn never left anything unguarded. Over 30 years as my chief financial officer, she had personally designed the encryption architecture that protected our entire logistics network. I entered the long alphanumeric sequence we had always reserved for top-tier corporate emergencies. The progress bar finished its run, and a single master folder appeared on the blank desktop. It was titled with nothing more than our son's name. I double-clicked. Inside lay a meticulously organized digital archive. Evelyn had spent 6 grueling months assembling a flawless, airtight financial case. Dozens of subfolders were labeled with offshore bank names, transfer dates, and corporate locations. I opened the first folder, which was clearly marked as travel itineraries. Clifton had told me confidently that he needed the money to take Renata to Paris. He claimed she was struggling with severe depression and desperately required a lavish European escape. I opened the first document in the queue. It was a receipt for 2 first-class round-trip tickets to Charles de Gaulle Airport, along with a booking confirmation for a 2-week stay at an exclusive boutique hotel near the Louvre Museum. For one disorienting moment, a wave of terrible confusion washed over me. Had he actually been telling the truth? Then I opened the next document in the sequence. It was a formal cancellation confirmation. The Paris flights and the luxury hotel reservations had both been fully refundable. They were booked on a Tuesday morning and canceled completely 48 hours later. The entire European vacation was a phantom. It was a calculated, cheap decoy designed to hand me a highly emotional excuse for his sudden, desperate need for fast cash. He knew I'd be livid about money burned on a frivolous trip, but he also knew I'd eventually write it off as typical spoiled behavior. It was the perfect smokescreen to mask his actual movements. I clicked into the next file, which held the real unmodified travel manifest. Clifton and Renata were not going to France. They had booked 2 seats on a private charter flight departing from a smaller regional Texas airfield. Their actual destination was Georgetown, the capital of the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands are not especially known for holistic mental health retreats. They are, however, recognized worldwide as one of the premier tax havens and offshore corporate banking capitals on the planet. A cold, heavy realization began settling deep in my gut. The missing $310,000 from the Shelby sale was not earmarked for shopping or fine dining. My son was moving raw capital offshore. I backed out of the travel folder and opened the next major directory, labeled Corporate Acquisitions. The screen filled instantly with hundreds of pages of scanned legal documents, offshore banking records, and intercepted corporate email chains. I leaned in closer to the monitor, my eyes working through the dense legal language. Evelyn had painstakingly tracked a series of digital communications between Clifton and an offshore holding firm based out of Georgetown. The firm specialized in anonymous, highly aggressive corporate buyouts. Clifton was using it as a legal shield to build a completely untraceable shell company. I scrolled down to locate the specific acquisition target. The name printed in bold black letters made my heart stop entirely. The target was Vanguard Refrigerated Transport. Vanguard was my single largest and most aggressive competitor across the entire South. For the better part of a decade, Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics and Vanguard had fought over every major supply chain contract in the region. We held the big grocery supermarket chains. They controlled the lucrative pharmaceutical distribution routes. We were squarely in the middle of a massive multi-million-dollar bidding war for a regional agricultural contract that would lock in our operational dominance for the next 20 years. I kept reading the pieces assembling themselves with horrifying clarity. Clifton was not simply a greedy son angling for an unearned payout. He was engineering a hostile offshore buyout of my biggest rival, but Vanguard was a badly struggling company. They needed a massive capital injection to restructure their debts and stay competitive against my fleet. The offshore holding firm required a substantial, entirely untraceable, earnest money deposit to initiate the blind acquisition process and lock in the purchasing rights. I opened the final financial attachment in the folder. It was the formal escrow demand from the Cayman holding firm. The required initial cash deposit to trigger the Vanguard buyout was exactly $350,000, the precise market value of Evelyn's fully restored Shelby GT500. I sat back in the leather chair, the cool glow of the laptop screen lighting up the sudden profound darkness of my new reality. The sheer scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Clifton was not merely stealing a classic car. He was actively plotting to steal my entire life's work. As a trusted executive inside the family business, Clifton had unrestricted daily access to our most sensitive corporate intelligence. He knew our exact operating margins. He knew the maintenance and fuel costs running through our entire refrigerated fleet. He knew the precise pricing models we used to bid on supply chain contracts. He knew every operational weakness and every strategic strength of Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics. His plan was brilliantly, sickeningly simple. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Money pried from his dead mother's hands would flow anonymously into a Caribbean shell company, which would swallow our weakened rival whole. Then, working entirely from the dark Clifton would turn his intimate knowledge of our pricing architecture against us, undercutting every bid we placed, stripping away contract after contract until there was nothing left to strip. My life's work would hemorrhage clients directly into Vanguard's hands. He would watch his own father go under all, while quietly collecting untaxed offshore dividends no one could trace back to him. The Shelby money was the trigger. Every personal dollar he owned was already consumed by Renata's bottomless appetite for the finer things. So he robbed his mother's grave to pull the pin on his father's empire. I turned to look at Sterling. He stood in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest, face unreadable eyes, steady on mine. He hadn't asked a single question since I'd sat down at that screen. He just gave me the room to absorb it. I couldn't find words for a long while. I sat there motionless, staring at the data glowing in front of me. For 6 months, grief had been my entire world, a suffocating, immovable weight that came from losing Evelyn. Now I felt it lifting not gently but scorched away by something far hotter. Clifton had stood in front of me and told me to get over it. He had reached into my grief and used it like a crowbar. Renata's manufactured depression, his mother's memory, all of it weaponized, all of it aimed at keeping me looking the wrong direction while he burned the house down. He had written me off as a broken old man crying alone in an empty garage. My silence to him was a white flag. I ejected the flash drive from the port and eased the laptop shut with a soft final click. I tucked the drive into my inside jacket pocket right alongside Evelyn's letter. She had spent whatever time she had left, quietly, building an arsenal for a war I hadn't even known was being waged against me. She handed me the one thing I needed most, the whole truth, documented and preserved, ready to be used. Clifton had declared war on the wrong man. He fancied himself some kind of shadow, corporate predator. What he had forgotten was who had built Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics from the dirt up and what that man did to people who tried to take what was his. I got to my feet, back straight, head clear. The grieving husband had served his season. The man who had dismantled competitors for 4 decades was back. I expressed my gratitude to Sterling for his silence and walked out into the open air. The drive home barely registered, but my mind was cutting through every detail with precision. I went straight to the office, drew the blinds, and locked the door behind me. I sat at my personal desktop, kept air-gapped from our corporate servers, and inserted Evelyn's flash drive. I needed to map the full depth of what they had built. I bypassed the financial ledgers in the master directory and opened a secondary folder labeled Internal Communications. A cascade of forwarded email chains and server logs filled the screen. Evelyn had cloned a hidden network drive before it could be erased. I pulled up the first thread. It was a precise operational breakdown, our supply routes, our most exposed client contracts, our soft underbelly laid bare in plain language. The sender wasn't Clifton. The address was scrambled, routed through a disposable service, but the cadence of the writing, the technical vocabulary, the way the arguments were framed, all of it pointed somewhere very specific. Evelyn had appended an IP trace to the bottom of the chain. She had walked it back to a single machine inside our headquarters. Terminal 4. The air went out of my lungs. That terminal was Conrad's. Conrad Felton, my vice president of operations, the man I had personally pulled from a sinking firm 6 years ago because I saw something of my own hunger in him. I had mentored him, paid him more than he'd ever earned anywhere else, handed him the inner workings of everything I'd spent my life constructing, and he had taken that access and pointed it like a weapon at my chest. Working through his correspondence with the offshore holding company, the real skeleton of the takeover came into focus, and it was sickening. Clifton hadn't conceived this. Whatever degrees hung on my son's wall, whatever confidence he carried into a room he simply wasn't capable of engineering. A covert acquisition of a competitor this size. He was a prop. He was the bloodline that unlocked the capital, the family name that made the initial deposit possible. Conrad drew the blueprint. Clifton supplied the cash. Conrad fed him a story that together they'd acquire Vanguard quietly and sit atop the logistics industry as partners. But there was a third folder sitting apart from all the corporate files. Evelyn had labeled it with one word, Renata. I clicked it open. My stomach dropped. Photographs, hotel receipts, hundreds of text message captures. This had nothing to do with corporate strategy. This was the record of a 2-year affair conducted without a single attempt at concealment. A private investigator Evelyn had hired had caught Renata and Conrad together at a high-end Houston restaurant, close and comfortable in a way that left no room for interpretation. There were receipts for hotel suites reserved under Conrad's name, each one timed perfectly to a weekend when Clifton was away. I read through the transcripts of their messages. It turned my stomach. These weren't love notes. They were a clinical, contemptuous dissection of my son. They ridiculed his desperation to keep Renata satisfied with increasingly expensive gestures. They treated his insecurities like a control panel, knowing exactly which buttons to push to keep him moving in the direction they needed. Conrad had seeded the Vanguard idea in Clifton's head from the beginning. Renata was the one who whispered in Clifton's ear every single night, telling him I was a stubborn old man who would never relinquish the company, that he'd be waiting in my shadow for decades if he didn't take matters into his own hands. She stoked his resentment. She nursed his greed. She kept at it until he genuinely believed that betraying his own family was not just justified, but overdue. The final layer was buried in a locked spreadsheet Conrad had shared only with Renata, the post-acquisition model. After the shell company absorbed Vanguard on the back of the stolen Shelby funds, Conrad intended to systematically pull every premium contract out of Whitfield Cold Chain and route it into the newly purchased company. My operation would collapse. But the holding company's profit structure was designed to push every dollar of what followed into a private Cayman Islands account, one that carried only Conrad and Renata's names. Clifton would have no access, not a cent. They were going to extract everything from him and leave him with nothing. They'd take his stolen money, use his corporate access to gut my company, then vanish together with the offshore wealth they'd built on his back. What they left behind for Clifton was the wreckage, a bankrupt company, federal exposure for fraud and theft, and no one standing beside him. My son was a fool. Vain, ungrateful, reckless, a man who'd pawned his mother's most treasured possession to impress a woman who was already planning to discard him. But he wasn't walking toward a payday. He was walking toward a slaughterhouse, too intoxicated by his own ambition and Renata's careful handling to notice the knife at his throat. I sat back and pressed my fingers against my temples. The scale of what I was looking at was almost hard to hold. A daughter-in-law betraying her husband, a lieutenant betraying his mentor, a son betraying his father, and at the center of all of it, a $350,000 car that Evelyn had quietly turned into a trap. She had spent her final months as a silent sentinel, collecting every scrap of proof, sealing it away, so that when the time came, I would have everything I needed. And I did. The banking trails, the forged escrow paperwork, documented proof of the affair, the precise shape of their endgame. They were still operating on the assumption that the Paris Stora had landed, that I was off somewhere nursing a wounded ego over a vacation oblivious, while their Cayman plan quietly clicked into place. I shut the folders down one at a time. I drew the drive from the machine and sat with it in my closed fist. What I felt in that moment was nothing like the fury that had consumed me in the garage that morning. That had been fire, uncontrolled and blinding. This was something else entirely. Still, settled, inevitable. Conrad had cast himself as the invisible hand behind the curtain. Renata had written herself the part of the untouchable woman who walks away clean with her lover and a fortune, and Clifton had convinced himself that selling out his own family was a masterstroke of self-determination. I picked up the phone. The quiet phase was done. The moment had come to construct something inescapable, a snare so precisely engineered that none of them stood any chance of slipping through it. They would go on believing their elaborate scheme was proceeding without a hitch. I would stand back and watch them stride confidently toward the finish line of their offshore theft, and at exactly the right instant, I would yank the floor from beneath them. My fingers were already reaching for the desk phone receiver, set to trigger the corporate lockdown, when my cell phone cut through the total stillness of my study with a sharp chime. I pulled my hand back and lifted the smartphone. A text notification glowed on the screen. The sender, Clifton. Just his name sitting there, knowing what I now knew about the depths of his financial betrayal and his role in covering for his wife's affair, sent a wave of cold, hollow revulsion through me. I opened the message, an image attachment. Below it, a single line of text. I tapped to load the photo. As it resolved across my screen, the scene came into focus. A high-exposure selfie snapped inside a private first-class airline suite. Clifton and Renata pressed together in their seats, practically luminous, with the self-satisfaction of two people certain they had pulled off the score of a lifetime. Clifton was wearing a tailored sport coat, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne toward the camera, in a mock toast. Renata was tucked against his shoulder, wearing the particular brand of wide, bright smile she saved exclusively for her most brazen acts of deception. Oversized sunglasses were propped on top of her head, a delicate silk scarf loose around her neck. They had the look of a moneyed couple departing on a leisurely European escape. Below the image, Clifton had typed, "Sorry about the car, Dad. We will make it up to you when we get back from France. Love you." I sat motionless in my chair, those words cycling through my mind on repeat. Sorry about the car. With 5 words, he had trivialized the theft of a $350,000 heirloom, his own mother's final masterpiece, as though it were a minor inconvenience. We will make it up to you when we get back from France. One more false layer of the smokescreen, assembled by Conrad, and handed off to my son to deliver. And then love you, of everything that hit hardest, deploying a term of family tenderness to soothe the very man he was scheming to bankrupt. It was almost too cynical to absorb. I studied their expressions in that photo. Every pixel of their faces radiated certainty. There they sat toasting with champagne bankrolled by my late wife's decades of sacrifice, convinced they were watching their plan unfold without a single complication. Clifton believed he was 3 steps ahead of a father too distracted by grief to notice. Renata believed she had successfully maneuvered her husband into financing her permanent exit with her lover. Both of them were toasting a win they hadn't actually secured, yet entirely confident. I was sulking at home over a ruined vacation while their fraud ran unchecked. I pressed my thumb to the screen and began zooming in on the photograph, the same surgical eye I brought to 9-figure merger documents. I examined the cabin lighting. I studied the arch of the oval windows. I scanned the reflection caught in Renata's sunglasses, and right there I found it. The crack in their flawless fabrication. Tucked in the upper left of the frame, soft-focused but readable behind the sweep of Renata's hair, a flight attendant was making her way along the narrow cabin aisle. She wore a distinctive tropical uniform belonging to an exclusive private charter airline I knew quite well. What mattered more was what she was carrying: a silver service tray, raised to shoulder height. Laid flat across the top of that tray, tilted at just the right angle, was a glossy travel magazine facing the camera. I kept zooming, pushing the resolution as far as the image would allow. The headline on the cover jumped off the screen at me. Discover the Cayman Islands, your ultimate Caribbean escape. A low, humorless laugh escaped me and died somewhere in the quiet of the empty room. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. So hungry to gloat, so fixated on sealing their fake alibi with a victory photo they had never thought to sweep the frame behind them. They had voluntarily handed me photographic proof of their actual destination. That magazine cover confirmed in physical terms everything Evelyn had already exposed through her flash drive. No transatlantic flight to Paris. They were pointed straight at the Caribbean banking corridor to close out the hostile Vanguard acquisition. I set the phone down on the mahogany desk with quiet deliberateness. Every piece was now positioned, their destination known, their intentions upon landing known, the full roster of co-conspirators driving this corporate coup known. Another man standing where I stood might have exploded, fired off calls to the police, had lawyers racing to the airport, bombarded their phones with threats until someone blinked. But building what I built didn't happen through outbursts. When your adversary is certain they've outsmarted you, tipping your hand is the one move you cannot afford. The moment I challenged Clifton directly, he would call Conrad. They would scatter scrubbing digital evidence bearing the stolen capital, constructing denials, and my company would be dragged through litigation ugly enough to rattle our clients across the South. No, what I required was for them to feel completely unthreatened. I needed them touching down in the Cayman Islands, walking through that offshore bank's door and locking themselves into the fraudulent transaction beyond any reversal. I needed every last stolen chip shoved to the center of the table before I flipped it. I picked the phone back up. A reply was necessary, and it had to be surgically calibrated. Too sharp a tone and Clifton would sense I was investigating. Too warm and nothing about it would ring true for a man whose irreplaceable vehicle had just been taken. What I needed was the textbook response of a worn-down passive-aggressive father, grudgingly acknowledging a son he was too exhausted to fight. I opened the keyboard. Not one word came from my fingers. No ultimatums. No demand for remorse. I navigated to the emoji menu instead. I tapped the plain yellow thumbs up. One icon. The universal shorthand for weary, wordless acknowledgement, a digital sigh made visible. It told Clifton precisely what he was hoping to see, that I was annoyed that my energy for the argument was spent, and that I remained entirely in the dark about the sprawling conspiracy hiding behind that cheerful photograph. I hit send. I watched the delivered indicator appear, and in that stillness something fundamental between us concluded. The father, the man who had written the checks, absorbed the disappointments, kept the door open was finished. What remained was a chief executive, and he had a threat to neutralize. I set the phone face down on the desk. The quiet war was now underway. I began laying down the first unyielding protocols to dismantle everything they were building. I lifted the phone again and placed a call to Celeste Osgood. Celeste occupied the top of the food chain in Houston's legal world. For 15 years, she had served as lead counsel for Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics, shielding the company from predatory rivals and every opportunistic lawsuit that came our way. Her mind worked like a blade, precise, fast, without wasted motion. She never needed unnecessary context and never hesitated once given a direct order. The phone rang exactly twice. When she picked up, her voice arrived crisp and fully alert. "Gerald," she said, her tone smooth and measured. "I'm going to guess this isn't a social call." I kept every trace of feeling out of my voice. The grief that had defined the past 6 months, gone. In its place, cold precision stripped down to the essentials. "Celeste," I said evenly, "tonight I need you to initiate a total operational lockdown." I heard the small sound of her adjusting in her chair. She caught the difference immediately. The mourning widower she'd been navigating around for half a year had stepped aside. Someone else had picked up the phone. "Tell me exactly what you need, Gerald," she said. I leaned back, my gaze settling on the dark glass of the window. "Start by freezing all access Clifton and his wife hold over the family trust accounts. Every last one." A brief pause. "That's a severe move, Gerald. The moment those trust accounts lock their credit cards, stop working at the register. Mortgage auto payments will bounce. Every primary liquid asset they rely on will be inaccessible by the time the sun comes up." I didn't move. "That is precisely what I intend, Celeste. Sever their financial oxygen supply entirely. Clifton spent the last of my goodwill a long time ago. I want them left with whatever cash happens to be sitting in their pockets right now." Keys rattled rapidly on her end. "Trust accounts are locked," she confirmed. "What comes next?" My voice fell lower, settling into something measured and grim. "Step 2 concerns Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics directly. Effective immediately, you are to strip Clifton of every corporate signatory privilege he holds. Pull his executive security clearances from the entire company network. Cancel his issued credit lines, revoke his building access credentials, and shut him out of the primary servers. He is no longer permitted to execute agreements, negotiate on behalf of the company, or so much as view the internal ledgers. I want him surgically removed from the operational infrastructure, as though he never had a seat at the table." Celeste stopped typing. A weighted silence settled across the line, thick with the understanding of what she was hearing. Stripping an executive of signatory authority without convening a board vote was not a routine action. "Gerald," she said, choosing her words with care, "pulling his privileges this abruptly will send shockwaves straight through human resources. The board of directors will have immediate questions." "Let them have their questions," I cut back sharply. "I built this entire company from a single battered delivery truck. I hold the absolute majority of the voting shares. Clifton has taken actions that pose a direct and severe threat to the stability of Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics. I will stand before the board and explain myself when the moment calls for it. Right now, you carry out the revocation protocol without delay." "Understood," Celeste said quietly. Her voice had taken on the particular qualities of someone watching the opening move of a ruthless corporate execution. "The executive revocations will be in effect within the hour. Is there a third directive?" I closed my eyes for just a moment, the image of Evelyn's midnight blue Shelby GT500 sitting silent and still inside Sterling Beaumont's storage warehouse, rising behind them. "Yes," I said. "One final matter, and it demands your most precise handling. Clifton took Evelyn's classic car this morning. He moved the vehicle to a private dealership and attempted to liquidate it for $350,000. He demanded an expedited wire transfer routed to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." I heard Celeste draw a sharp, stunned breath. "Gerald, that is grand theft auto. I can have local law enforcement positioned at the airport the instant his flight lands. He could be in handcuffs before he clears baggage claim." "No," I said, and my voice left no room for debate. "Do not contact local law enforcement. Do not file a standard police report. The moment local authorities are pulled in, this becomes a messy public family spectacle. Clifton will retain some expensive defense attorney, drag everything through the mud, and tie the proceedings in knots for as long as he can manage. I want a far cleaner, considerably more destructive outcome. I pressed my elbows down onto the desk and leaned in. Rather than the police, I want you to file a formal stolen asset dispute directly with the financial institution holding the title. Route the fraudulent wire transfer attempt through federal banking channels. Sterling Beaumont has already placed a mandatory internal security hold on the pending transfer. I want you to build on that hold. Let the automated compliance systems of the international banking network carry the weight. Celeste let out a low, appreciative sound. I follow the logic, she said. If we report the unauthorized sale and the offshore wire attempt through federal fraud channels, it triggers an automatic international anti-money laundering protocol. The banks will freeze the offshore destination accounts on their own authority. They will flag Clifton and Renata as high-risk financial criminals. What started as a local theft becomes an international banking crisis. Precisely. I let the word land with quiet finality, cold satisfaction threaded through it. I don't want Clifton sitting in a county jail cell calculating his bail options. I want him stranded in the Cayman Islands trust fund's completely inaccessible corporate identity, dissolved and his name permanently flagged across the international banking system. When he walks through the doors of that offshore bank tomorrow morning, expecting to collect his stolen money, I want him staring at a wall of federal fraud alerts. I want him to feel the exact moment the ground disappears, when he understands there is nothing left. I'll have the fraud dispute drafted immediately, Celeste told me, and the caution had left her voice entirely. What replaced it was the focused energy of someone ready for the fight. The asset freeze, the executive revocations, the banking alerts, all of it will be fully active before dawn. None of this will reach them until it's too late. That is the entire point, Celeste. My eyes stayed on the digital clock sitting at the edge of my desk. They believe they've outmaneuvered a grieving widower. They think they're aboard a plane carrying them toward a lavish, stolen future. Make certain the financial cage is sealed shut before their wheels ever touch the ground. I ended the call and set the phone down. The study held its silence completely. I crossed to the wide bay window and stood looking out over the grounds of my estate. Moonlight stretched long, pale shadows across the manicured lawn below. The machinery I had just set in motion made no sound at all, but it was ruthless, and nothing was going to stop it now. Clifton and Renata had constructed their entire scheme on one foundational assumption that I would accept whatever they told me in order to preserve the fiction of a united family. They had read my patience as a father and mistaken it for weakness. They had looked at my grief and decided it meant incompetence. They had catastrophically underestimated the man who built Whitfield Cold Chain. Logistics. The storm I had assembled was already moving. I intended to watch it take everything from them. Morning came in slowly, a pale gray wash spreading across the broad facade of Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics headquarters. I pulled into the private executive parking garage at precisely 7, keeping my routine intact, as if the entire architecture of my life had not just been rebuilt overnight. Moving through the polished lobby, I gave a courteous nod to the 3 security guards at their stations, holding my posture deliberately, soft shoulders, slightly rolled forward, carrying just enough visible fatigue to read as a man still deep in mourning. I rode the private elevator to the top floor and stepped out into the quiet corridor of the executive suite. My assistant greeted me with a look of practiced, sympathetic concern. I returned a faint, unsteady nod, performing the role of the devastated widower with complete precision. I entered my corner office, shut the heavy door behind me, and took my seat. I left the overhead lights off, letting the room remain wrapped in shadow. I lifted the desk phone and pressed the intercom, instructing my assistant to send Conrad in at once. Then I sat and waited in the dark. Conrad didn't keep me long. 5 minutes later, my vice president of operations walked into the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the future was already his. Conrad was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, carrying the kind of aggressively ambitious smile that had probably opened a great many doors for him. He had the polished ease of a corporate predator, precisely the type of man capable of sleeping with his boss's daughter-in-law and engineering the ruin of his own mentor without losing a single night of rest. He came across the carpet and stopped at the front of my desk. His expression shifted at once into a carefully composed mask of deep concern. He took in the unlit room and then looked down at me, offering a slow, doleful shake of his head, a display that was entirely rehearsed. "Gerald," he said, his voice softened to just above a murmur loaded with manufactured empathy, "you look absolutely worn through. You should be home, not here. This place will manage just fine without you for a few days." I raised both hands and pressed them against my face, dragging them slowly downward before releasing a ragged, uneven exhale. I let my voice come out thin and rough. "I'm exhausted, Conrad," I said, my eyes dropping to the desk. "Losing Evelyn has extracted something from me that I don't have the words to measure. The silence in that house has become unbearable." Conrad dipped his head, gravely hands, sliding into his pockets. "I know, Gerald. We're all concerned about you. You need to pull back and let the rest of us absorb the load. That's the reason you built a team around you." I lifted my head slowly and held his gaze directly. The man working to destroy me looked back with flawless composure. "That is precisely what I called you in to discuss," I said, keeping my voice just above a whisper. "I've spent the night turning over the future of Whitfield Cold Chain Logistics. I've given decades to fighting for every contract, every account, every route, and that fight has hollowed me out. I need to step back, Conrad. I need to return to the estate and learn how to exist without her." I watched it happen behind his eyes, a raw flare of greed, immediate and involuntary, before he smoothed it back under another coat of counterfeit sympathy. "Gerald, you can't simply walk away," he said evenly. "This company is your legacy." I shook my head, a slow and deliberate motion, and eased back into my chair. "A legacy means nothing if the man behind it no longer has the strength to hold it up," I replied. "I'm not abandoning anything. I'm transferring the immediate operational burden. Conrad, you've sat in that vice president's chair for 6 years. You know our supply routes, our fleet maintenance standards, our key corporate accounts inside and out. I need someone I can place my trust in to hold the helm while I withdraw to the background." Conrad stood without moving, working hard to contain what must have been a surging, almost overwhelming sense of triumph rising inside him. What you are about to hear is the moment when everything Gerald had quietly suspected came fully into the light, and what he chose to do next will tell you everything about the kind of man he is. Before we get there, I want to ask you if you discovered that someone close to you had been working against you the entire time. Would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until every piece of evidence was in your hand? He was convinced I was placing the crown directly into his hands. He believed his quiet manipulation and covert corporate sabotage had somehow aligned perfectly with my moment of grief. "Gerald, I would be absolutely honored to step up," he said, his voice quivering with excitement. He was packaging as humble obligation. "Whatever you need me to take on, I will handle without a single misstep." I reached into my desk drawer and withdrew a thick stack of formal corporate transfer documents I had assembled the night before. I set them squarely on the center of the desk and pressed my index finger against the top page. "I'm officially elevating you to Acting Chief Executive Officer for the Southern Regional Division," I announced. "And more importantly, I am granting you full, unrestricted legal authority over the Vanguard acquisition accounts." Conrad's eyes dropped to the documents, his breath catching just slightly. He had been quietly scheming to funnel Clifton's stolen money into an offshore buyout of Vanguard, entirely blind to the fact that I had known every detail of his betrayal for some time. And now I was placing those exact accounts into his hands with my signature on the paperwork. "I want you to oversee the entire Vanguard merger." I went on, my voice flat and without inflection. "I am authorizing you to manage the earnest money deposits, coordinate the financial restructuring, and execute the finalized acquisition ledgers on behalf of this company. You will hold total legal autonomy over the corporate merger accounts. I am trusting you to do right by the future of this logistics network." Conrad reached out slowly and lifted the stack of documents, his fingers closing around the heavy paper with a deliberate grip. He was holding the precise legal authorization he needed to quietly bleed our contracts into his offshore shell company. He genuinely believed I had just handed him an unsupervised license to siphon millions. What he was holding was a precisely engineered federal trap. By accepting legal authority over the Vanguard merger accounts, Conrad was binding his name and signature to every fraudulent transaction he was about to set in motion. I was assembling an airtight federal corporate fraud case around him, and he was cheerfully providing the confession. Gerald, I will not let you down. Conrad promised, the documents pressed against his chest. I will handle Vanguard with complete discretion. You have my word on that. I offered him a faint, hollow smile in return. I know you will, Conrad. Just see to it that the banking deposits go through without disruption. Keep the transition smooth. Conrad nodded with real vigor, then turned and practically drifted out of my office on a current of barely suppressed elation. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, and I was alone in the dim room. The instant the latch clicked, every trace of frailty left my face. My spine straightened. The cold clarity came back to my eyes. Conrad was already making his way back to his terminal to push the hostile offshore buyout through. Certain he was the cleverest man in the building, he began routing the massive financial transfers using Clifton's stolen capital, entirely unaware that Celeste Osgood had already embedded international banking fraud alerts on those specific offshore accounts. I sat without moving in the quiet of that office, a dark and settled satisfaction spreading through me. Conrad thought he was stealing my empire. What he had actually done was accept the rope I had just placed in his hands. Federal authorities were going to find a clean, fully documented paper trail pointing 48 hours went by after Conrad walked out cradling the federal fraud trap I had delivered straight to him. Over those 2 days, I kept up my carefully maintained performance as a shattered, grieving widower. I sat in my darkened suite, working through a thermos of black coffee and monitoring the digital tracking software Celeste Osgood had installed on our mainframe. I watched with deep, quiet satisfaction as Conrad frantically logged into the Vanguard accounts, hammering at the offshore wire transfer process. He pushed deep into the night-running stolen capital through corporate channels, never suspecting that every keystroke was being captured, time-stamped, and transmitted in real time to the Financial Crimes Division. The trap had been baited, accepted, and the jaws were drawing shut around everyone involved. I needed to do nothing at all. I sat at the desk, watched the digital logs fill with entries, and waited for the moment of detonation to obliterate their carefully tended illusion of victory. That detonation came at precisely 9 Saur on a Thursday morning. I was in the quiet of my home study eyes, drifting over the grounds of the estate, when my personal cell phone began buzzing against the wooden desk. I looked at the screen, my son's name with an international routing prefix beneath it. I let the phone ring 3 full times, giving the tension building on the other end the space to become unbearable. I drew a slow breath, deliberately cleared any trace of coldness from my voice, and slipped on the warmest, most bewildered paternal tone I could manufacture. Then I answered, "Clifton," I said, letting my voice carry the gentle surprise of a man interrupted mid-morning. "I thought you and Renata were supposed to be completely off the grid on your romantic escape. Didn't expect you to be ringing your old man at this hour." "Dad!" Clifton's voice broke through in a gasp. The panic in it was raw and unfiltered. His breathing was ragged and uneven, audible over the line with every labored inhale. Underneath it, in the background, I could make out the ambient texture of a high-end resort. In motion, the light chime of crystal, the low current of well-heeled conversation, and the unhurried melody of tropical steel drums drifting through an open hotel lobby. "Dad, something has gone terribly wrong. I'm standing at the front concierge desk right now, and everything is locked down completely. My corporate card just declined for the 3rd time. I tried my personal platinum card, and it was rejected the moment it was swiped. I pulled up my mobile banking, and every trust account is showing 0. Every single one frozen. Dad, the bank won't authorize anything at all. I can't even cover a cup of coffee." I absorbed every syllable of the terror in my son's voice, a deep, chilling wave of satisfaction moving quietly through me. The financial guillotine Celeste Osgood had built had fallen with perfect precision. Clifton was standing in the gleaming lobby of a 5-star Cayman Islands resort, encircled by extravagance, and he was completely, thoroughly broke. A would-be corporate raider without a cent to his name. I pushed the satisfaction off my face and wrapped my response in a thick layer of fatherly concern. "Oh, son," I said, tongue-clicking with exaggerated sympathy. "That sounds frustrating, but you really shouldn't be working yourself into a panic over a routine banking hiccup. You know how aggressive those automated fraud prevention systems can get. It's most likely just a standard security flag doing its job. A security flag? He practically launched the words through the phone. Dad, they have locked down everything. The concierge is eyeing me like I've wandered in off the street. They're threatening to involve local authorities if I can't produce a valid form of payment for the suite. You need to get on the phone with the Wealth Management Division right now and have them release the hold on my accounts immediately. I produced a long, slow exhale shaped to sound like a man of a certain age, mildly baffled by the machinery of modern banking. Well, Clifton, some of this may be of your own making, I said, gently measured. The bank's fraud detection is calibrated to catch spending that falls completely outside your normal patterns. You're a Houston resident, and suddenly large charges are attempting to clear from an overseas location. Of course, the fraud department intervened. They're doing exactly what they're paid to do, protecting your assets from unauthorized access. But I am the one spending the money, Clifton said, his voice fracturing under the pressure. I'm the account holder. You just need to tell them I'm traveling. Tell them I'm on vacation. Tell them to release the freeze. I let out a soft, unhurried chuckle, warm, mild, entirely unbothered. I'm sure it will all sort itself out once we explain the situation. I'll ring the customer service line and let the fraud department know you're exactly where you told me you'd be. I'll inform them that you and Renata are safely on your romantic holiday in Paris, France, and that any charges originating from the European Union are fully authorized and expected. The silence that swallowed the far end of the line was extraordinary. It was dense, suffocating the silence of a man who has just registered the pressure plate shifting beneath his foot. Clifton could not correct me. He could not blurt out that he was actually standing in a banking corridor in the Cayman Islands positioned to execute a hostile corporate takeover. Naming his real location would incinerate the Paris smokescreen he had spent weeks constructing. It would collapse the vacation fiction, implicate the stolen car money, and expose the true purpose of the entire trip. He was encircled by the walls of his own deception. He could hold to the Paris story or admit to the corporate treason. There was no third door. Dad, he finally breathed, his voice barely a whisper, trembling under the weight of the realization settling over him. Please, I did not give him the room to construct another desperate lie. I kept my voice light and unhurried, delivering the final psychological blow with the precision of a surgeon closing a wound. Don't give it another thought, Clifton, I said, warmth wrapped around every syllable. The bank is always a battle to reach on a Thursday morning. As it happens, I'm just heading out the door for a long, quiet weekend up at the Northern Lake fishing trip, no agenda. The reception up there is practically non-existent, so I expect I'll be out of contact for a few days. I'll get on the phone with the bank first thing Monday morning when I'm back. In the meantime, just settle in, enjoy the French architecture, and try one of those croissants for me. Give Renata my love. Before he could form a single syllable in response, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I set the phone down on the desk without a sound and eased back into my chair. It was done. I closed my eyes and let the absolute stillness of the room settle over me. The trap was perfectly closed. They were stranded, exposed, and entirely alone. I remained at that mahogany desk for a long stretch after ending the call. The hush in my study was total, a stark counterpoint to the frantic unraveling I knew was playing out at that very moment in a sunlit Caribbean lobby thousands of miles away. I knew exactly where Clifton's mind was going to go next. When a man believes he is going under, he reaches for anything within arm's length, no matter how thin. His corporate identity was gone. His personal wealth was locked away. The elaborate web he had woven alongside Conrad and Renata was coming apart at a breathtaking speed. In Clifton's panicked mental landscape, one lifeline remained. He needed the earnest money for the Vanguard acquisition. He needed the 350 vaporals he believed he had cleanly extracted from his mother's legacy. He needed Sterling Beaumont. I didn't have to wait long for that to play out. Exactly 14 minutes after I set the phone down, it rang again. Sterling's private garage line. I picked up immediately. Gerald. Sterling's voice came through rough and carrying a particular dry amusement. You called it dead on. The kid just rang the shop. He was completely coming apart at the seams. I leaned forward, my forearms settling against the cool surface of the desk. Walk me through all of it, Sterling. Nothing left out. Sterling cleared his throat. He bypassed the front desk and called my direct line, voice raised so high I had to pull the receiver away from my ear. That polished, arrogant businessman act he tried to put on yesterday gone entirely. He was begging. He demanded that I manually override the 24-hour internal security hold on the wire transfer. Said it was a matter of life and death, a critical emergency that couldn't wait another minute. Practically ordered me to push the $350,000 through to the offshore account right then. And your response? I asked, a cold, settled satisfaction rising in my chest. Exactly what you asked for, Sterling said evenly. I told him to bring his voice down and pay close attention. I informed him I couldn't push the wire through, even if I'd wanted to, because those funds were no longer under my authority. I let that sit for a moment, Sterling continued, and I could hear the kid's breathing go ragged on the other end. Then I put the finishing blow in. I told Clifton that early this same morning, the state DMV had officially flagged the title of the 1966 Ford Mustang Shelby GT 500 as a stolen asset. I told him the legal representative of the estate had filed a formal dispute, declaring the vehicle had been unlawfully removed from a private residence and fraudulently presented for sale. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Clifton in the center of that gleaming resort lobby, the Caribbean warmth turning to ice water in his blood. What was his reaction? I asked quietly. He tried to deny it. Naturally, Sterling scoffed. He started stammering, swore it was a massive misunderstanding, claimed he had your full blessing to liquidate the estate. Said if I'd just released the funds, he'd straighten everything out with you after the fact. But his voice was unsteady, Gerald. He understood the game had turned on him. I cut him off before he could construct another excuse. I told him it had moved well past a simple paperwork issue, because he had attempted to wire the proceeds of a stolen asset across international borders. I informed him the transaction had automatically triggered a federal banking alert. The $350,000 was now fully impounded by federal authorities, under suspicion of international wire fraud and money laundering. The local authorities had already been out to the warehouse to take the vehicle into custody as state evidence. The strategy was airtight. Clifton couldn't argue against a federal banking freeze. He couldn't charm his way out of a money laundering investigation. He had stepped into a vault, and Sterling had spun the lock. He went completely silent, Sterling recounted. I thought the line had dropped, but I could hear him breathing. I could hear Renata in the background, her voice going shrill, asking why the hotel manager was heading toward them with security in tow. He finally asked me what he was supposed to do. I told him that was a conversation for him and the federal prosecutors to have. Then I wished him well on his Parisian vacation and hung up. I let out a long, slow breath. Thank you, Sterling. What you've done for this family carries real weight. Whitfield Logistics won't forget it. You don't owe me a thing, Gerald, Sterling replied, and his voice left no room for argument. Evelyn was a legend. Nobody takes her masterpiece like that and walks away clean. I'm just glad I got to be the one who shut the door on him. Sterling ended the call, leaving me once more in the still expanse of my study. I crossed to the wide bay window. The southern sun threw hard, unsparing light across the grounds of my property. I held the image in my mind, my son marooned on a tropical island. He and Renata standing in a lobby they could no longer pay to occupy. Their corporate cards useless. Their accounts locked down by Celeste Osgood's precisely placed orders. No liquid cash, no way to settle the hotel bill, no way to buy a seat on a flight back home. In the Cayman Islands, failing to pay your hotel is not a matter that gets handled with sympathy. Management doesn't extend grace to Americans whose funds have evaporated. They call the island authorities without hesitation, and beyond that immediate humiliation, the corporate coup was dead on arrival. The offshore holding firm required a substantial deposit to initiate the hostile Vanguard buyout. With those funds seized by federal investigators, the acquisition would collapse on itself. The holding company would cut all ties with Clifton immediately to stay clear of federal scrutiny. Conrad, sitting at his terminal inside my corporate headquarters, would soon find that the offshore accounts were flagged and the money was never arriving. He would panic frantically, trying to scrub his digital trail completely, unaware that I had already positioned him in a role where his culpability was legally irrefutable and fully on the record. Renata's carefully constructed plan to drain my son and flee with her lover had blown apart entirely. She was now stranded on an island alongside a man she secretly despised, a man who was fast becoming the central figure in a sweeping federal fraud investigation. She had pushed Clifton into stealing his mother's car to underwrite her final betrayal, and in doing so, she had sealed herself inside the same inescapable trap. They were cut off, completely stripped of their influence, their resources, and the arrogant certainty that had driven every move they made. The financial empire they had reached out to seize had instead closed its hand around them. I stepped away from the window and returned to my desk. I had protected what Evelyn and I had poured everything into building. The silent war was finished, and the outcome was absolute. But a victory constructed entirely in the shadows eventually requires a reckoning in the open. For 48 hours, I sat in the quiet of my study, monitoring the digital tracking software as it documented their collapse in real time. The Cayman Islands are a magnificent destination when you arrive backed by the full resources of a thriving corporate empire. They become an unforgiving, hostile maze when your accounts are frozen, your credit cards are rejected at every terminal, and your name is actively flagged across the international banking system for wire fraud. I knew precisely what they were being put through. They were removed from their oceanfront suite. They couldn't reach the money they had stolen from Evelyn's beloved Shelby. Utterly stranded, their power and their illusions stripped away in equal measure. In the end, Clifton had no choice but to swallow his considerable ego and place a humiliating, desperate call to Renata's distant relatives. He had to beg someone to come get them. Those relatives, who had always regarded Clifton as an inexhaustible source of money, were now scrambling to purchase 2 emergency tickets on a deeply discounted budget carrier just to get them back to Houston. The journey home was humiliating. Cramped middle seats, surrounded by the very kind of people they had always quietly looked down upon. I was settled in my leather reading chair, working through the final logistics reports for the upcoming quarter when the heavy oak front doors of my estate exploded open. The impact sent a sharp crack echoing down the long hallway, followed at once by the rapid hard clicking of high heels against polished hardwood. I didn't rise. I didn't move at all. I simply closed the leather-bound folder, rested my hands in my lap, and waited for the storm to find its way to my study. Clifton and Renata swept into the room like something feral. The distance between the glowing, triumphant couple in that airplane selfie and the 2 haggard, hollow-eyed figures now standing before me was almost impossible to measure. Clifton still had on the same tailored sport coat from the photograph, but it was creased beyond recovery and darkened with sweat. His hair sat in disarray, and his face was burning red, with a barely contained frantic fury. Renata looked unraveled entirely. The delicate silk scarf was gone. Her oversized designer sunglasses were shoved up into her disheveled hair, and her eyes burned with a hard, calculating rage. They had crossed an ocean expecting to return as conquering corporate raiders. Instead, they had crept back as bankrupt fugitives, surviving on the reluctant charity of distant relatives. Clifton drove both palms down onto the surface of my mahogany desk and thrust his face within inches of mine. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he shouted, his voice breaking under the weight of exhaustion and rage. "Do you understand what an absolute nightmare we just lived through? We were evicted from our hotel, Dad. The resort management treated us like common criminals. Every card I tried was completely useless. The bank handled me like a suspect, and you did nothing. Nothing to fix it. You told me you'd call the fraud department Monday morning, but when I reached customer service, they said no one from your office had ever authorized a release on those accounts. We had to go to Renata's uncle and beg him to buy us budget airline tickets to get off that island. You humiliated us completely." I looked at my son and held my expression perfectly still. My voice stayed where it was. No apology came. I simply watched him, letting the silence press against every wall of the room. That absence of reaction seemed to push Renata past whatever edge she had been standing on. She stepped forward, shouldered Clifton aside, and planted herself directly in front of the desk. She had come prepared for this moment. She was going to play the victim. "This is entirely on you, Gerald," she snapped, her voice ricocheting off the wood-paneled walls. "We went to France because my mental health had completely broken down. I was suffering. I needed a restorative environment to heal, and Clifton was doing what any devoted husband would do. He sold that old car out of love because he was trying to save his wife. But your banking incompetence destroyed everything. You were too occupied performing the role of the grieving widower to make a simple phone call and clear his accounts. Because of your negligence, what should have been a healing retreat became a psychological ordeal. I was publicly humiliated in a foreign country. We were made to feel like criminals because you couldn't manage a basic financial task. You owe me an apology, Gerald, and you owe us compensation for the emotional harm your failure caused. I sat without moving, absorbing the sheer breathtaking audacity of what she had just said. She was standing in my study, screaming about a ruined trip to France with no idea that I was holding a high-resolution copy of the flight manifest, confirming they had touched down in Georgetown. She was deploying her fabricated fragility to demand apologies and financial restitution from the very man she had been working to bankrupt. She stood there performing wounded dignity while the digital transcripts of her affair with Conrad sat securely on a flash drive in my top drawer. She delivered the role of the traumatized fragile wife without a single visible crack. If I hadn't read her messages, if I hadn't seen the cold, calculated plans she had laid out for bleeding my son dry and vanishing with her lover, I might have found something in her performance to believe. But I knew what she was. I knew she was a parasite. And I knew that Clifton, standing at her side and nodding in furious agreement, was a tragic instrument being used by someone he trusted completely too blind to recognize the poison living inside his own household. "Dad," Clifton said, his voice dropping a register as he reached for something resembling authority. "You're going to call the wealth management division right now. You're going to have them restore my trust account access immediately. Then you're going to wire $100,000 into my personal checking account to cover the damages, the humiliation, and the incompetence you showed this week. We are not leaving this study until my financial access is fully restored. If you refuse, I will drag this family through a legal battle that will gut whatever reputation you have remaining in this city. You're losing your grip, Dad, and I won't allow your decline to consume my future." I looked at my son. I took in the dark rings beneath his eyes, the dampness on his brow, and the frantic, entitled desperation radiating from the way he held himself. He was trying to bully me. He was wielding the threat of public embarrassment like a weapon, utterly unaware that there was nothing left in his hand to swing. I pressed both palms flat against the desk and rose from my chair with quiet deliberateness. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't meet Clifton's glare. Instead, I turned and gestured toward the heavy double doors of the study. "If it's financial restoration and compensation you want to discuss," I said, my tone level and unhurried, "we won't do it here, standing in the shadows like quarreling children. We'll do it properly in the formal living room. Come with me." Clifton shot Renata a smug, satisfied look, utterly certain his aggressive ultimatum had fractured my resolve. Renata straightened her posture and lifted her chin with cold arrogance. They turned and walked ahead of me out of the study. I followed several paces behind, keeping my pace slow and deliberate. They crossed the threshold into the grand living room, stepping into the wide, unlit space. Before Clifton could demand I switch on a lamp, the room detonated in light. The massive crystal chandelier above the adjacent dining table blazed to life, throwing a harsh, unsparing glare across everything beneath it. Clifton and Renata stopped dead. The room was not empty. Arranged around the long, polished dining table was a carefully assembled company of their complete destruction. At the far end sat Celeste Osgood, spine perfectly straight, a thick leather briefcase open in front of her. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and an expression that carried the particular chill of a predator that has already won. To her right sat Sterling Beaumont, arms folded heavily across his chest, his eyes fixed on Clifton with undisguised contempt. Beside Sterling sat a man neither of them recognized, sharp, dark suit, quiet, and still projecting the understated, dangerous authority of a federal agent. But it was the figure at the opposite end of the table that pulled every drop of color from Renata's face. Conrad, my traitorous vice president of operations, was slumped in a high-backed chair, looking entirely broken. His tie was pulled loose, sweat had soaked through his collar, and his hands lay trembling on the polished wood in front of him. He looked nothing like a man who had been engineering a corporate takeover. He looked like someone who had peered over the edge and understood he was already falling. Renata made a soft, strangled sound, her hand shooting up to cover her mouth. Her eyes jumped between me and Conrad, the true shape of what she was looking at, beginning to cut through the armor of her delusion. Clifton, however, was still too deeply submerged in his own ego to register what the room was telling him. He squared his shoulders, stepped into the light, and tried to command it. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice filling the silence. "Is this supposed to be some kind of joke, Dad? Why is Sterling here? And Conrad, what are you doing sitting at my dining table? You're supposed to be managing the regional merger accounts." Clifton turned his glare back to me, hands tightening into fists at his sides. "I told you I wanted my funds unlocked, not some theatrical family ambush. I was done playing this game. I moved past them, my footsteps swallowed entirely by the Persian rug, and claimed my seat at the head of the table. No raised voice, no matching his frantic energy. I simply lifted my right hand and directed a steady finger toward a heavy wooden chair, positioned directly across from mine. "Sit down, Clifton," I said, my voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You're about to find out exactly what a trip to Paris really cost you." Clifton faltered, his eyes cutting nervously toward the federal agent, but the sheer gravity pressing down on that room gave him no choice. He slowly dragged out the chair and lowered himself into it. Every trace of his earlier bravado dissolved like smoke. Renata remained on her feet a moment longer, her whole body trembling before she collapsed into the seat beside him. "Allow me to introduce our guests." I began, my tone perfectly measured and conversational. "You already know Celeste, my lead corporate counsel, and you clearly haven't forgotten Sterling. The gentleman seated to your left is Special Agent Pruitt of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division." I let that word federal hang in the silence like a held breath. Special Agent Pruitt has been taking a very close look at the sudden, highly irregular movement of international funds tied to the Vanguard acquisition. Clifton swallowed hard, his gaze snapping toward Conrad. "What does Vanguard have to do with any of this?" he stammered. "I just want my trust funds unlocked." I turned to look at my former vice president. "Conrad," I said quietly, "why don't you explain to my son exactly what became of the Vanguard acquisition?" Conrad flinched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken, pathetic whisper. "The acquisition is dead, Clifton. It's gone entirely." "What are you talking about?" Clifton snapped, lunging forward in his chair. "You were supposed to finalize the earnest money deposit on Thursday. We had the offshore shell company in place. The capital was ready to wire." "Stolen capital, Celeste." Osgood cut in, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Funds obtained through the fraudulent sale of a classic automobile that was never yours to sell. Money that was immediately flagged by the state, seized by federal banking authorities, and permanently frozen before it ever reached your phantom holding company." Clifton wheeled on Sterling. "You told me the transfer was just delayed," he accused. "You said it was a security hold." "I told you the federal government impounded the funds," Sterling replied, his voice flat and cold. "And I told you the local police took the vehicle. You attempted to move a stolen asset across international borders to bankroll a corporate coup. Did you genuinely believe you were the smartest person in the room?" I leaned forward and laced my fingers together. "You see, Clifton, you and Conrad were convinced you had pulled off a perfect piece of corporate sabotage. You believed you could bleed millions from Whitfield Cold Chain, logistics push that capital through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and leave me standing in the wreckage of a bankrupt shell. And you, Renata," I shifted my attention to my daughter-in-law, watching her shrink back into her chair. "You thought you could steer my son into financing your permanent disappearance. You were certain your affair with Conrad was an airtight secret. You believed you could spit on my grief, drain my accounts, and simply vanish to some tropical shore." Renata broke into violent, convulsing sobs, her small frame shaking with what looked very much like genuine terror. "Your father is entirely correct," Mr. Whitfield Special Agent Pruitt stated, his voice calm and even as he slid a thick stack of printed transcripts across the polished table. "We have fully documented evidence of wire fraud, grand theft auto conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and international money laundering. Your future and your freedom now belong to the federal government. Now you will sit quietly and listen to Special Agent Pruitt Explain exactly how you are going to surrender. The silence that descended after those words was suffocating. Clifton sat frozen in his chair chest, heaving in shallow, rapid breaths, eyes fixed on that thick slab of federal transcripts. The hard reality of what was coming was finally punching through the armor of his haughty arrogance. But Renata was not prepared to go quietly. She had the cornered, reckless instinct of a predator with nowhere left to run. She buried her face in her hands and unleashed a torrent of loud theatrical sobs that rang across the dining room. She shook her head side to side, tears streaking the polished mahogany as she tried desperately to resurrect the very lie that had just been torn apart. "This is one enormous misunderstanding," Renata wailed, eyes swinging wildly between Special Agent Pruitt and me. We were in Paris. We were walking along the river trying to help my mental health. I was in the middle of a severe psychological breakdown. "Gerald, you have to believe me. Clifton only wanted to take his wife somewhere she could heal. You are twisting a loving gesture into a federal crime. We never went to any island. We never committed any wire fraud. You are listening to the wrong people. Your banking errors shattered my already fragile state of mind, and now you are letting government agents terrorize your own family over a simple vacation." I did not interrupt her performance. I let her cry, let that high-pitched wailing fill every corner of the room until the fake sobs began to ring hollow and desperate. When she finally stopped to draw breath, I reached slowly into the leather folder, resting beside my right hand. I withdrew a single crisp sheet of paper and sent it gliding across the length of the table. It came to rest directly before her folded hands. Renata looked down at it, and just like that, the manufactured tears stopped cold, as a wave of undeniable dread moved across her face. "That is a certified copy of the private charter flight manifest," I said, my voice stripped of any feeling whatsoever. "It shows your names, your passport numbers, and the precise flight path of your private jet. You did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to restore your fragile mental health in France. You flew due south, touching down at the international airport in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. You were seated in a first-class cabin, sipping expensive champagne and flipping through travel magazines showcasing Caribbean resorts. Your carefully constructed Parisian alibi is a complete fabrication, Renata. The federal government knows exactly where you went, exactly when you landed, and exactly which luxury resort had you removed this morning." Clifton stared down at the flight manifest, his face draining to an ashen, sickly gray. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the ambient hum of the room, "we can explain the change in destination. It was a last-minute call. We just wanted some sun." I let his excuse fall to the floor without acknowledgement. I reached back into the leather folder and drew out a far thicker bundle of legal documents, each page bearing the official seals of the Cayman Islands Financial Registry. I slid the stack across the table and watched it come to rest alongside the flight manifest. "Those are the incorporation papers for a Caribbean shell company," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my son. "A phantom holding firm engineered specifically to funnel millions of dollars through unregulated offshore channels. And if you look carefully at the bottom of the last 3 pages, Clifton, you will find your own signature authorizing the creation of that entity. You will also find the authorization for a massive earnest money deposit intended to initiate a hostile corporate takeover of Vanguard Logistics." Clifton stared at the signatures, his eyes going wide with genuine horror. He shook his head violently, hands trembling as he reached out toward the paper. "I did not sign these," he stammered, voice climbing in pitch. "I swear to you, Dad, I have never laid eyes on these specific documents in my life. That is not my handwriting. Someone signed my name." I rested my elbows on the edge of the table and leaned in. "I know you didn't sign them, Clifton," I said, my voice ice cold. "You do not have the intellectual capacity to engineer a complex international corporate merger. You were simply the necessary financial instrument. You ransacked the legacy your dead mother left behind to purchase a Caribbean shell company and strip me of everything I built. But you were too foolish to see that you were nothing more than the piggy bank." Clifton blinked, his mind visibly straining to absorb the insult and the revelation at the same time. "What are you saying?" he demanded, looking desperately around the table. "If I didn't sign the corporate papers, then who did?" I let my gaze travel slowly down the length of the table until it settled on the broken, sweat-soaked figure of my vice president. Conrad hadn't moved a muscle since the lights came on. He sat in quiet agony, eyes locked on his lap, utterly defeated. "Tell him, Conrad," I said softly. "Tell my son how you forged his signature on those offshore incorporation documents. Tell him how you took the $350,000 he stole from his mother's estate and used it to bankroll your own hostile takeover. Tell him how you intended to bleed Whitfield cold chain. Logistics dry redirect our primary accounts into your hidden Caribbean firm and leave Clifton answering to federal prosecutors for corporate fraud he never masterminded." Clifton turned slowly, fixing Conrad with a look of raw, gutted betrayal. "Conrad," he whispered, his voice fracturing at the edges, "is that true? Did you set me up to take the fall for the Vanguard buyout?" Conrad lifted his head. He looked at Clifton, then he looked at Renata, then finally his eyes found mine. He gave a single slow nod, a quiet, shameful acknowledgement of everything. "I forged the documents," Conrad admitted, his voice hollow and drained of life. "I needed the earnest money to secure the offshore accounts, but putting my own name on them would have triggered an internal audit immediately. I needed someone wealthy and trusting, someone with enough corporate clearance to get past the initial security checks, but not enough skepticism to question why they were being handed the wheel." Clifton looked as though he'd taken a blow to the chest. He sank back into his chair, the full weight of his catastrophic miscalculation pressing down on him all at once. He had turned against his father, plundered his own mother's estate, and wagered his entire future, all to be used as a pawn by a man he'd believed was his ally. He hadn't been a partner in anything. He had been a prop in someone else's scheme of corporate treason. But the humiliation wasn't finished. I redirected my full attention to Renata. She was now sitting rigidly upright, every muscle braced. "You maneuvered my son into funding your permanent exit," I said. "You deliberately choreographed the timeline to align with the sabotage." Clifton stared at his wife, eyes widening. "Because Conrad was never just a co-conspirator. He is your lover." The words landed and stayed there, sharp, immovable. Clifton physically recoiled, his gaze lurching back and forth between my face and the woman sitting next to him. He shook his head in rapid, jerking motions and let out a breathless, broken laugh that came out closer to a wheeze. "That is insane," Clifton stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "That is absolutely ridiculous. Renata loves me. She would never do something like that. You're only trying to drive a wedge between us because you can't stand that I finally took control of my own life." Renata seized the narrow sliver of doubt, pressing herself hard against Clifton's side and seizing his forearm in a white-knuckled grip. She forced another wave of theatrical tears, burying her face against his shoulder. "Don't listen to him, Clifton," she wept, her voice muffled against his jacket. "He is trying to destroy our marriage to punish you for standing up to him. He is a bitter, paranoid old man, inventing vicious lies to pull you back under his thumb. Conrad and I only ever spoke about corporate matters. I was trying to help you succeed. I did not raise my voice to argue. Arguing is what you do when your footing is uncertain and your evidence is thin. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew the small metallic flash drive, the very same one my brilliant, perceptive Evelyn had taped beneath my desk drawer before she left this world. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the hard light from the crystal chandelier catch its silver casing. My wife was a woman of uncommon clarity. I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes a room go absolutely still. "Evelyn saw through your cheap manufactured warmth the very first day Clifton brought you into our home, Renata. She recognized a parasite looking for a host, but she also understood that a mother warning her son about his own wife is a battle a mother almost never wins. She knew Clifton would defend you without a second thought, so she set about collecting the evidence needed to safeguard this family. Even as her body gave out, her mind stayed razor sharp. I stepped away from the table and walked slowly toward the massive 75-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the living room. The silence at my back was complete. I could feel every set of eyes in that room tracking my movement. I reached behind the display panel and pressed the flash drive into the primary digital port. I picked up the remote from the polished credenza, turned to face them, and hit the input button. The screen came alive, flooding the dim room with a cold blue wash of light. I glanced at Conrad, now weeping silently into his hands, entirely broken. I glanced at Renata, her theatrical tears evaporated, completely replaced by a mask of naked, visceral terror. And then I looked at my son, who was staring at the blank screen with the fixed, paralyzed dread of a man standing on the tracks, listening to the thunder of an oncoming train. Evelyn hired a private firm to install concealed surveillance inside your home 6 months ago, I said evenly. She had a camera placed directly inside your own living room, Clifton. She wanted to know exactly what was happening under your roof while you were busy playing the role of the visionary corporate heir. I pressed play. The screen resolved immediately into a crisp, wide-angle view of Clifton and Renata's lavishly appointed living room. The digital timestamp burning in the lower right corner marked a Tuesday afternoon exactly 6 months prior. For a brief moment, the room on screen was still. Then the front door swung open, and Renata walked into frame Conrad, stepping in right behind her. Clifton drew a soft, bewildered breath, watching his own home play out in front of him. He watched Renata let her designer bag drop onto the sofa and turn to face the vice president of my company. There was no hesitation between them, no professional courtesy. Conrad stepped straight in, hands finding her waist, pulling her into a deeply unhurried, familiar kiss, the kind that belongs to people who have been doing this for a very long time. Clifton stopped breathing. He sat rigid, both hands locked around the edge of the mahogany table, knuckles blanching white. On the screen, Conrad pulled back from the kiss and smiled down at Renata. He actually bought the offshore expansion pitch. Conrad's voice came through the surround sound with perfect clarity. I cannot believe how unbelievably gullible your husband is. I told him he needed to set up an independent shell company in the Caymans to get around Gerald's oversight, and he just nodded and asked for the paperwork. Renata's laugh on the recording was a cruel cutting sound that tore through the silence of my estate. Clifton is a desperate idiot, she replied, pouring 2 glasses of bourbon and handing one to Conrad. He is so consumed with crawling out of his father's shadow that he will sign absolutely anything you slide in front of him. He genuinely thinks he is executing some masterwork. Conrad took a sip and let a slow smirk settle on his face. Everything is perfectly staged, he said with easy confidence. I have the Vanguard acquisition funds ready to go. Once Clifton funnels his share of the capital into the holding firm, I execute the digital transfer, wipe the ledger clean, and leave him with the liability. Federal investigators will find his name on every document. By the time Gerald figures out that his entire logistics empire has been gutted, you and I will be on a private beach, and Clifton will be looking at a 20-year federal prison sentence. Renata looped her arms around Conrad's neck and rested her head against his chest. I cannot wait to be done with him, she whispered on the recording, her voice soft and affectionate. Just make sure the money clears before we go. I don't want to spend one more miserable day pretending to care about this pathetic family. I pressed pause, locking the image of Renata and Conrad in their embrace on the screen. The digital silence slammed back into the room heavier, more suffocating than any silence that had come before. I said nothing. I simply looked at my son. Clifton was destroyed. The change was immediate and total. The arrogant, entitled man who had blown into my house demanding apologies and demanding money was completely gone. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. A low, wrenching sound worked its way out of him. Not quite a cry, something rawer than that. Pure, unguarded heartbreak. Fundamental betrayal. He looked at the frozen image on the screen. Then he turned his head and looked at Renata. She was staring at her lap, unable to meet his eyes. Her face drained of color and entirely without defense. The silence did the rest, a lethal final strike that severed the last thread holding Clifton's world together. He kept his eyes on that paused frame, his wife's body resting easily against the man who had been his most trusted colleague. A deep guttural sound tore its way out of him. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. The betrayal was total, the humiliation absolute. In the space of a heartbeat, the shock curdled into blinding, incandescent rage. Clifton launched himself across the dining table. He moved with sudden, violent force, sending his chair crashing backward onto the polished floor. He threw his body over the mahogany surface, scattering the neat stacks of federal transcripts in every direction. His hands found Conrad's lapels and locked on. Before Conrad could mount any defense, Clifton wrenched him forward and drove a devastating blow straight into his face. The sound of bone meeting, bone cracked through the room like a gunshot. Conrad cried out sharply, his head snapping back as he toppled from his chair and hit the rug. Clifton vaulted over the table's edge and came down hard on top of him. His fists flew in a blind, frantic flurry. He was screaming, not words, just raw, incoherent anguish. Renata shrieked and scrambled away from the violence, pressing herself flat against the wall. Hands covering her face, terrified the fury would swing toward her. I simply watched the inevitable collapse of an alliance that was never built on anything but lies. The undercover federal operative moved with terrifying precision. He cleared the table in an instant, reaching the struggling figures on the floor without breaking stride. Pruitt issued no verbal warning. He reached down, seized the collar of Clifton's jacket, and hauled him off Conrad in one powerful, controlled motion. Clifton flailed, throwing a wild punch. Agent Pruitt deflected it without effort, stepped inside his guard, and executed a clean tactical sweep. Clifton hit the floor hard, the air driven from his lungs in a single ragged gasp. Pruitt pressed him face down on the carpet knee, planted firmly between Clifton's shoulder blades. Right arm twisted sharply upward behind his back. "Stay exactly where you are," Pruitt commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "If you resist a federal officer again, I will add assaulting an agent to your charges. Breathe slowly and do not move." Clifton stopped fighting. He lay pinned against the floor, tears of defeat running down his face and soaking into the rug beneath him. A few feet away, Conrad rolled onto his side, groaning miserably, both hands pressed to his bleeding nose. Every trace of his polished corporate veneer was gone, replaced by the raw, pathetic reality of a broken man and a caught thief. Sterling Beaumont rose slowly from his chair and looked down at the two of them with open contempt. He moved to stand alongside Pruitt, crossing his arms to ensure no one considered making a run for it. I turned back to the table, straightened my cuffs, and gave a single nod to my counsel. "Celeste," I said, my voice perfectly level, "I think it's time to make the consequences official." Celeste Osgood rose from her seat, smoothed her suit jacket, lifted a fresh document from the table, and looked down at the wreckage below her. When she spoke, it was with a precision so cold it left absolutely no opening for negotiation or appeal. "Conrad Felton and Renata Hargrove," Celeste began, her voice ringing clearly through the still room, "you are both being taken into federal custody tonight. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has formally indicted you on multiple felony counts. International wire fraud conspiracy to commit corporate espionage and money laundering. We have furnished the prosecution with irrefutable digital evidence, unauthorized transfers, forged documents, and audio recordings that explicitly establish your intent to defraud. You attempted to drain millions from a federally regulated commercial entity. The holding company in the Cayman Islands has already been seized. Your personal accounts have been permanently frozen under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." Conrad let out a whimpering sob from the floor. He understood that Celeste's words marked the official end of the life he had known. Renata slid slowly down the wall until she was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the ruins of everything she had schemed for. She had traded a life of luxury for a federal cell, and that reality was now pressing the breath out of her body. Celeste then shifted her cold, exacting gaze down to my son, still pinned beneath the unyielding weight of Special Agent Pruitt on the Persian rug. "Clifton Whitfield," she continued, her tone stripped of any trace of familial consideration, "while you were an unwitting instrument in their larger corporate espionage operation, your own actions remain seriously illegal and entirely indefensible. The state of Texas is charging you with grand theft auto and the fraudulent forgery of a legal vehicle title. In addition, the federal government is indicting you for conspiracy to commit international wire fraud, arising directly from your attempt to move the illicit proceeds of that stolen vehicle into an unregulated offshore account. You willfully engaged in the theft and liquidation of a valuable estate asset, and you will answer for those charges in a federal court of law." Special Agent Pruitt reached to his tactical belt and produced a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic ratchet echoed through the room as he fastened them securely around Clifton's trembling wrists. He pulled my son to his feet. Clifton couldn't bring himself to look at me. He hung his head, shoulders shaking with silent, broken sobs. From the entrance hall, the front doors swung open again. 3 additional federal agents stepped into the living room, their dark suits and grim expressions a perfect mirror of Pruitt's. They crossed the room swiftly toward Conrad and Renata. Conrad offered no resistance at all. He simply extended his hands, face slick with blood, as the agents clicked the cuffs into place around his wrists. Renata, however, began to scream, a shrill, genuine scream of pure, unraveling panic. She thrashed violently against the agents as they pulled her upright, kicking and demanding to be released. It was desperate and utterly futile. The agents pinned her arms and locked the steel bracelets into place. They marched her toward the door, her cries ricocheting through the grand corridors of my estate. Conrad was brought out next, head hanging in total defeat feet, dragging against the hardwood. Finally, Agent Pruitt steered Clifton forward. My son stopped for the briefest moment at the threshold of the living room. He turned his head just slightly and gave me a last shattered look, desperate, broken mute with apology. I did not soften my face. I offered no reassuring nod. I held his gaze with the cold, settled resolve of a man who had protected his life's work from the very people he had spent that life trying to shelter. Pruitt pushed him forward, and Clifton disappeared into the darkened hallway. But before the heavy oak doors could close completely behind him, Clifton suddenly wrenched his body sideways. He threw his weight against Special Agent Pruitt's tactical grip, catching the federal officer momentarily off guard. The desperate motion threw him off balance, and he crashed heavily onto his knees. Rather than getting back up, he scrambled across the polished hardwood floor, handcuffed wrists dragging awkwardly behind him, moving like a wounded, frantic animal, his breathing ragged and torn until he reached the edge of the Persian rug where I stood. Before anyone could intercept him, Clifton lurched forward and buried his face against my leg. He wrapped his arms around my knees and held on his tears, soaking into the fabric of my trousers. The living room, which moments ago had been filled with the noise of federal arrests, dropped back into a suffocating leaden silence. Agent Pruitt stepped forward immediately to retrieve his prisoner, his expression tight with professional embarrassment. But I raised my right hand palm flat, a silent and absolute command, and he held his position. I wanted to hear what my son had to say. Clifton looked up at me. His face was a bruised, swollen wreck of terror and devastation. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, raw whine. "You have to stop this. You have to tell them it's a mistake. I didn't want any of this. I was manipulated. Renata and Conrad, they used me. They twisted everything around until I believed I was doing the right thing for the company. I never wanted to steal from you. I never wanted to hurt you or Mom. You know who I am, Dad. You raised me. I am your son. I am your blood. Please don't let them take me to a federal prison. I will do whatever you ask. I'll sign the trust accounts back over to you. I'll divorce Renata tomorrow. Just make one phone call and tell them to drop the charges. Please, Dad, I am begging you. I am your blood." I stood without moving, looking down at the broken, weeping man wrapped around my legs. I did not feel a single flicker of paternal warmth. I did not feel the sudden pull to shelter him, to step between him and the consequences bearing down on him. The man sobbing at my feet was a stranger to me. I thought about the 38 years I had spent building a future for him, the education, the grooming, the golden road I had paved at every turn. I thought about Evelyn and the bottomless reserves of love and patience she had poured into raising him. We had given him every conceivable advantage, every luxury, every last ounce of our devotion, and in return he had treated his mother's death as a financial opportunity. He had read my grief as a weakness to exploit. He had sold out his own family for a fleeting taste of borrowed power and the approval of a venomous, calculating wife. Now he was claiming manipulation, desperately trying to offload the blame onto Conrad and Renata, refusing at every turn to accept any responsibility for his own greed. He was a coward straight through to the end. I did not extend a hand. I did not offer comfort. Instead, I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around something cold and jagged. I withdrew my hand and held the object up beneath the hard light of the crystal chandelier. It was a single silver key on a vintage leather fob, stamped with the classic emblem of a roaring Mustang. Clifton stopped crying. His red, swollen eyes locked onto the key, and a look of profound, terrified confusion moved across his face. He knew exactly what it was. It was the key to the vintage Shelby GT500, the very same key he had surrendered to a fraudulent automotive broker just weeks before. You thought you could erase her memory to bankroll your pathetic corporate treason, I said, my voice dropping to a low glacial whisper that sliced through the stillness of the room. You thought you could liquidate your mother's most prized possession, a vehicle that embodied everything vibrant and alive about her, just to seed an offshore shell company. But you failed, Clifton. You failed at business. You failed at marriage. And you failed at being a son. I tracked the fraudulent transaction the moment those funds touched your private account. I had my legal team contact the authorities, freeze the assets, and personally retrieve the vehicle from the impound lot before the federal government had even convened the grand jury. Your mother's legacy is resting safely in my private garage, perfectly intact, exactly where it belongs. Clifton let out a soft, strangled gasp, his eyes going wide with the full horror of what that meant. He had nothing left to bargain with. Whatever leverage he imagined he held was completely gone. Dad, he whispered again, the word hollow and weightless in the vast room. I'm sorry. I raised a son for 38 years. I said my words deliberately measured, each one precisely placed. I raised a boy I believed possessed honor, integrity, and a genuine love for his family. But the man weeping on my floor is not that boy. You are simply a thief, a weak, greedy parasite who tried to bleed his own family to the bone. I looked directly into his terrified, unblinking eyes, making certain my next words would permanently extinguish whatever dim hope he was still clinging to. My son died of a heart attack the exact same day his mother did. You are absolutely nothing to me. I took one deliberate step backward. The movement broke Clifton's grip on my trousers. His hands fell away and dropped uselessly against the Persian rug. Before he could drag himself forward again, Special Agent Pruitt was on him. The federal operative seized Clifton by the back of his collar and hauled him to his feet in a single forceful motion. There was no more hesitation. Pruitt clamped a firm hand onto Clifton's shoulder and marched him out of the living room, heavy tactical boots striking the hardwood floor with each step. Clifton did not look back. He walked with his head down, entirely defeated, and stepped out into the cold, dark night. The heavy oak front doors closed behind him with a resounding, definitive thud. The lock engaged. The estate fell quiet. I stood alone in the vast room, surrounded by the wreckage of a family that had destroyed itself. I slid the silver key back into my pocket. I turned away from the doors and walked slowly into the deep, complete silence. 6 months have passed since that night. The machinery of justice moves slowly, but it grinds without mercy. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, forged signatures, digital records, audio recordings of his own treachery, Clifton came to understand he had no remaining leverage. His expensive defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. My son, the man who had fancied himself a corporate kingmaker, traded his tailored suits for a standard issue uniform. He accepted a sentence of 5 years in a state correctional facility. At his sentencing hearing, he scanned the gallery, searching the wooden benches for a familiar face, reaching for one last moment of parental sympathy. I was not there. I had grieved the loss of my son long before that day, and I had chosen to redirect my energy toward the living. The federal proceedings against Renata and Conrad were considerably more theatrical, utterly devoid of dignity. The moment federal prosecutors laid out the offshore banking records and the surveillance footage from their own living room, their alliance disintegrated on the spot. They turned on each other like trapped, starving animals. Renata wept before the judge, claiming she had been psychologically coerced, insisting Conrad had dragged her into the scheme against her will. Conrad fired back by producing hundreds of text messages proving Renata was the primary architect of the financial plan, detailing her relentless greed and her explicit designs to abandon Clifton. The judge was wholly unmoved by their vicious, pathetic spectacle. Both were handed 10-year sentences in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and international money laundering. Their dream of a sun-drenched tropical shore was permanently replaced by cold concrete and steel bars. With those parasites removed from my life, I turned my full attention back to Whitfield cold chain logistics. The betrayal had laid bare a deep systemic rot at the executive level of my own empire. I did not wait. I launched a thorough, unsparing purge of the entire corporate board. Every vice president, director, and senior manager who had enabled Conrad, or who had simply averted their eyes, was terminated immediately. I cleared the top floor entirely. To fill the void in leadership, I did not go hunting for outside executives with polished resumes and empty promises. I went down to the shipping floor instead. I promoted the loyal warehouse managers, the shift supervisors, and the logistics coordinators who had given decades of their lives to the actual work that built this company. They understood the business at its bones far better than any boardroom politician ever could. The transition brought a surge of fierce, genuine loyalty to the enterprise. As for the 350th funeral Clifton had stolen from Evelyn's estate, the federal authorities recovered every cent from the frozen Cayman accounts. When the funds cleared my bank, I knew immediately what my wife would want done with them. I did not fold the money back into my corporate holdings. Instead, I established the Evelyn Whitfield Cardiovascular Research Foundation, dedicating the entire sum to medical grants for the study and prevention of sudden heart failure. Her name would not be tied to a cheap, fraudulent Caribbean shell company. Her name would be tied to saving lives, extending her beautiful legacy far beyond her tragically short time on this earth. Tonight, the sky above Houston is a sweeping canvas of bruised purple and burning orange. The setting sun throws long golden shadows across the clean concrete floor of my private garage. I walk slowly past the rows of silent machinery until I reach the far corner. The 1966 Shelby GT500 sits perfectly still, its polished blue paint catching the last of the fading light. I pull the silver key from my pocket, open the heavy driver's side door, and settle into the vintage leather seat. The cabin carries the scent of aged oil-rich leather and the faint lingering memory of Evelyn herself. I reach out and run my hand across the smooth wooden rim of the steering wheel. She had restored every inch of this magnificent machine, with her own hands pouring her whole soul into the work. I fit the key into the ignition and turn it. The massive V8 engine roars to life, a deep rolling mechanical thunder that shakes the very bones of the garage. It is a perfect machine built by a truly perfect woman. I move the heavy manual transmission into gear roll out of the driveway and drive forward into the glowing horizon, knowing my beautiful wife is smiling down on me, and that I am finally and completely at peace with my life and with the legacy I have protected. I know she would be proud. Greed is a poison that blinds you to the very hands that sustained you. When you reduce family to nothing more than a resource to be stripped and used, you surrender your right to their loyalty, their shelter, and their love. True legacy is never built on what you can inherit or take. It is built on integrity, on hard work, and on the respect you extend to those who cleared the path before you. Never confuse an old man's quiet for ignorance, and never underestimate a parent's willingness to reduce their own empire to ash just to make certain the rats don't walk away with the feast. Music. I used to ride upon your shoulders thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines, and when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river. Tears slipped slowly on the sea, but no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter. Every step I take, and every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lives within me, like an echo calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, "Child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter." Every step I take and every time I choose to stand when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints. One day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold, not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain, through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain. The world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am my Father's daughter. I am my Father's daughter. That is where Gerald's story ends. Not in bitterness, not in collapse, but behind the wheel of a restored 1967 Shelby GT500, driving forward into the light his wife left behind. This road cost him more than most people will ever understand. He lost a son not to death, but to greed and cowardice. He watched the people he trusted most turn his grief into a weapon. And yet I believe God placed that fireproof pouch in exactly the right spot, sealed by the hands of a woman who loved her family enough to protect it, even after she was gone. Evelyn did not leave Gerald helpless. She left him prepared. That is a kind of love that does not expire. If this story taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. Never mistake patience for weakness. A man who moves in silence and waits for the full picture is far more dangerous than one who reacts in the heat of the moment. Guard your legacy like it is living, because it is. What you build can be stolen, dismantled, or redirected the moment you stop paying attention. When someone shows you who they are through their smallest choices, believe them. Greed does not appear overnight. It announces itself quietly long before the betrayal arrives. And if you ever find yourself choosing between protecting your empire and protecting your integrity, choose integrity. The empire can be rebuilt. Your name cannot. If this story moved you, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that loyalty still matters and that the truth has a way of finding the surface. And if you have not already, come join us here at Dad Revenge. There are more stories waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people who have earned your trust.